Welcome to everyone in the room and to everyone in the Zoom audience. My name is Michael Cavuto. I'm a graduate student here at Duke in English and African American Studies, and an organizer for the Climate Change, Decolonization, and Global Blackness workshop and speaker series, one of 3 streams of FHI's Entanglement Project. The Climate Change, Decolonization, and Global Blackness Initiative, convened by Dr. Michaeline Critchlow and Dr. Denise Ferreira da Silva, seeks to inhabit the nexus of these 3 global phenomena with the concerted aim of understanding contemporary decolonizing practices as a vital role in realizing world futurity. Indeed, we are living in a time when modernity's ecocidal tendencies are coming to a head through increasingly compounded climatological catastrophes, the frontline victims of which most often live in formerly colonized areas of the global south, and those nearer communities rendered marginal, precarious, and disposable by the interests of hegemonic power. Those most recent ecological disasters filling our news cycles, from the massive scale of earthquakes in Turkey and Syria to the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, present unfathomable challenges to reigning mentalities intent on continuing or simply amending the extractive and coercive practices precariously upholding global capitalism. Rather, a radical reorientation toward existence as a multitude, or what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls deep implicancy, is called for, which in her words would begin with the view that decolonization is the only relevant ethical principle in our times. Today, we have the honor of welcoming our 7th speaker in the series, Duke's own Professor Brian McAdoo. Brian McAdoo is a disaster researcher and head of the PlanetLab in the Earth and Climate Science Division at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. His talk today, Natural Disasters, Marginalization, and Planetary Health, will dispel the misnomer of natural disasters by attending to the climate vulnerability of human communities amidst more than human ecological locales threatened by anthropogenic exacerbation. Under his leadership, the PlanetLab studies disasters both for what they reveal about the ways in which human activity produces the conditions for these events to occur, and for what they compel in diverse forms of communal resilience. In other words, cultural practices of survival that subvert and overcome conditions of large-scale premature death imposed through systemic iniquities. PlanetLab's planetary health approach seeks to work and learn with local communities to develop transdisciplinary interventions that ameliorate these conditions while providing infrastructure to sustainably resituate human communities within their living environments. Through the lens of decolonizing methodology, PlanetLab proposes one model for north-south redistribution of environmental scientific resources that prioritizes a reparative ethics while opening its own mode of knowledge production to intercultural humanistic relationality. Earlier in our series, Professor Annie-Dominique Curtius shared with us instances in which increasingly severe hurricanes in the Caribbean have uncovered previously unknown burial sites of the enslaved labor forces that transformed the islands during the colonial era. These uncoverings have been culturally and poetically figured as an agential act of the dead making themselves known. Members of a local community group in Guadeloupe described these environmental ceremonies, quote, as if the dead understood that the time had come to let us know. This is a return of history we all expected. Environmental decline as a result of the colonial abuse of bodies, lives, and land here expresses an ancestral agency of the past. Scientific attention from the North has been received in the form of archaeologists, a science of preservation. Dr. McAdoo and PlanetLab would honor such events as an imperative, that through community-led restorative environmental intervention, agency, no less ancestral, might be returned to the future. Please give a warm welcome to Brian McAdoo.
Thank you for the introduction. Also, thanks for the invitation to come here and share these ideas with you. When I saw that at Duke University, where I've only been now for just over a year and a half, had a lab dedicated to climate change, decolonization, and global Blackness, I said, I've come back home to the right place. So thank you for putting together this workshop and really expanding the ideas how we consider both people, environment, and racism in our current world. I kind of cheekily named this talk Brown is the New Green. It's the first time exploring some new ideas, thinking about how the idea of global Blackness or global brownness can teach us a lot of lessons as how marginalized people deal with their own environments. So in this talk, I'm going to explore some of these ideas using some examples from different places around the world. For the last 20 odd years, I've been working mostly in South Asia and the South Pacific region, but I think you'll see some connections here that'll make some pretty strong ties between the actions that happen in those areas and also what happens in the Caribbean and the Americas and elsewhere. I'm also happy to be here because at the Franklin Humanities Institute, because this is fundamentally a human story. And a lot of the information I've gained over the last few years, I've gained from a series of wonderful people who have survived in the face of increasingly violent world. And these are some images of some of these pictures taken by my very dear friend who happens to be a professional photographer, as you can tell, about how people are dealing with their environment, how they're suffering through the environment. I think I'll let some of these images speak for themselves, but during the course of the talk, I will be getting the stories of some of these people and figuring out how we can look at disasters through the lens of the people who suffer with them. Okay, so Michael mentioned that I'm a disaster researcher, and this is core in a theory that was developed in the early 2000s that kind of considered a disaster happening at the intersection of a natural hazard of some kind and some community that's vulnerable. As a geoscientist, my interests mostly lie in the hazard side of the equation. I want to know, what are the physics behind these things happening, because I find that fascinating intellectually, but mainly for planners and the idea of reducing the risk of disasters. I'm interested in understanding the frequency and the magnitude of how often these things occur. How big are they when they happen, and how often do they occur? Those two pieces of information are absolutely critical for people who are coming up with solutions to these problems. On the other side of this equation, if you will, is the idea of vulnerability. And these are things that can break or that can be hurt. And this can include ecosystems, peoples, entire societies, can happen in buildings and infrastructures. Also institutions, financial institutions, governments can fall in the face of disaster. Healthcare systems are also stressed by different hazards they get impacted by. This happens at the intersection of these two is where disasters occur. I first want to introduce my PhD student, Alia. Alia is from a village in northern Pakistan in the Karakoram range, and she goes by one name. And she has been an absolute gem to my lab. She's the first PhD student that's chose to join the lab even before I got to Duke. And she's been a tremendous leader throughout this. And she's, based on her experience growing up as kind of a farm girl in a rural area in Pakistan, she knows people and she knows the land and she knows how people are dealing with the land. So she's got me to expand my view of how we do things. And she's also been an invaluable field assistant in our area in Nepal because she speaks fluent Hindi and most people can understand a little bit of Hindi, but also because she's of the region, she gets it. So our work in the PlanetLab is fundamentally concerned with this one question, which has got three different parts to it. But how can we have sustainable development without damaging the Earth systems that are here to keep us alive and that support our very health and well-being? So many of the solutions we come up with for development, recognizing people need to continue developing, cause more harm to the environment. And then in the long term, or even the short term, can cause very acute problems and make those development goals push further back. Okay, thanks to Alia and the work we've been talking about for the last year and a half or so, we're starting to expand this idea of disaster risk, where disaster risk actually occurs at the intersection of hazard with a vulnerability, but also an exposed population. And I kind of ignored this part of the classic equation for a while because, well, of course, if you're exposed, you're going to be, if you're not exposed, that is, you're not going to be exposed to the risk. But Alia got me to think about, like, what does it mean to be exposed and why do people choose to be exposed? Do they have a choice in it? Do they not have a choice in it? Do people migrate if they're in harm's way, or they maybe don't have the actual resources to migrate? So what we want to do is kind of take this apart to understand these different parts of the problem, to get to individual, sometimes academic fields, but individual stakeholders that can actually have something to say about defining this disaster risk so that we can come up with the right kind of solutions that will reduce the suffering. So on the hazard side of the equation I mentioned before, this happens at the intersection of the Earth, the hard lithosphere, earthquakes, atmospheric events, biosphere, and hydrosphere all come together. You know a little bit about each one of those. The vulnerability space, this is the intersection of human systems with knowledge systems, ecosystems, especially in the developing world. Humans rely on ecosystems a lot for their survival, but also infrastructure. These are all things that can be damaged by impact from a disaster. We start getting into the solution space. This is where I consider exposure as being part of the question, recognizing that everybody on the planet is going to be exposed to some kind of hazard because of global climate change. How do we adapt to those risks that we're facing or the hazards we're facing? And this is where you start getting in the solution space. We have different ways you can solve a problem. You can develop a policy to say, okay, if there's an earthquake, you evacuate. You have a earthquake kit in your house, might be a formal policy, or during a hurricane, you might leave the coastal zone. We have engineering solutions. We build something to protect against it. We have healthcare solutions. If you get injured, we have to have a healthcare system in place to get you back up on your feet, business architecture, et cetera. We're going to come back to this model throughout the talk. We're going to complicate it a little bit more also. Before I move on, though, I also want to mention in the UN speak, there's a lot of words that get thrown around, and oftentimes they kind of come to cross meanings. So we're trying to be careful with our definitions here. I consider mitigation, resilience, and adaptation as working opposite hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So for example, if we talk about climate mitigation, we're often talking about bringing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, which will make our hurricanes less intense, as an example. If you think about resilience, well, vulnerability is really in the space of things like the Sustainable Development Goals. That's not my job right now. There's people working on that. So if we think about what can communities do to become more resilient after an impact hits, that's some of the tools we're thinking about in our lab. And then adaptation is, again, recognizing that people are going to be exposed to these different risks or different hazards. Therefore, how do we adapt to them in different ways? Okay, so another question, we're shortening a little bit. How do we improve human development without increasing the environmental risk? When we think about the vulnerability space, we can consider the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to be very clear to point out, we often think about UN, international development, these sort of things. This is also a critical issue in our communities here in the United States. If you live in an urban community, you're poor, marginalized, Black, which we'll talk about a little bit later, these very same goals, access to poverty, clean food, clean water, these things are challenges in our communities right here in Durham, amongst other places. Excuse me. We're going to look at the intersection now of these vulnerabilities and things we want to kind of buoy up our society a little bit so that our society is less in need of development. But in doing so, we are stressing the planet. This idea of planetary boundaries came from the Stockholm Environmental Institute some years ago and says that in certain different ways, we're exceeding the Earth's capacity to withstand the changes we're putting on them. So if you look at the bottom, for instance, under the P and N, these are the nitrogen and phosphorus that we're putting into the Earth system with our agricultural systems. They're now overwhelming coastal zones and causing lots of damage there. Similarly, the EMSY, don't worry about the details, but that has to do with biodiversity and how we're going through the largest mass extinction in recent times. So these are the areas where you can see land system change. We're not quite in the danger zone yet, but we're rapidly getting there, where the Earth can no longer actually withstand the changes and continue to regenerate itself based on these stresses. The only book recommendation I'm going to make today is a book called Donut Economics by a woman named Kate Rayworth, where she's trying to use existing paradigm of economics to consider how these two models can come together and say, how can we achieve sustainable development without overshooting the boundaries of what the planet can handle? We talk right now about the right to pollute, or how different countries in the developing world say, look, you guys in the developed world have burned all the carbon so you can develop. It's our turn to burn our carbon now. Well, there's some truth in that right now, but it's kind of a scary proposition. So we need to come up with really clever solutions so we can live within Kate Rayworth says, within the donut, where we have enough of the fundamental things to survive, the food, water, education, healthcare, et cetera, but we don't have so much, we're not exceeding that we're causing further damage to the planet. Okay. In our lab, we're using what we call a planetary health model. And to put this more simply, we'll get to a simple definition, but I want to talk about the evolution of planetary health a little bit. So this started off in the colonial times, where With colonial medicine, they call it colonial medicine, which was trying to keep the colonizers in the tropics alive. We found people were dropping like flies when they went down there from different diseases they hadn't been exposed to, the heat sometimes. That evolved to international help at the post-Berlin conference in 1884, where they kind of came together and started divvying up the colonies. And they said, well, now we got to keep all of us alive and kind of come together and learn from each other. The missionaries came in at this point also, and they said, we want to make sure we keep our Christians in the tropics alive, and eventually evolved to kind of where we are right now in the idea of global health. We have the Duke Global Health Institute, which is truly interested in keeping everybody, be you in the tropics or in the Northern Hemisphere, alive. On kind of another side, we're starting to consider also complexity of the environment. We all are wearing masks right now. Okay, you all are wearing masks right now because of a One Health issue. We look at this intersection between animal welfare and human health. Certainly ecosystems impact these intersections also. So how changes in ecosystems can impact, excuse me, these intersections between animals and people is the realm of eco-health. And eventually we get to planetary health, recognizing this is all happening on a planet where we are making humans specifically are changing the entire systems that impact every ecosystem on the planet, every animal on the planet, and certainly every human on the planet. So to kind of get to a simpler definition of planetary health, we are concerned with protecting the Earth systems that protect us. If we no longer have air to breathe, water to drink, and a clean an atmosphere that doesn't keep us from cooking, we're going to be in trouble. These are some examples of how these big scale changes are impacting our health. I just highlight a few. It's lots of different changes you can imagine. You can see these here, but look at the atmosphere, climate change, heat, drought can impact food systems, heat stroke, et cetera. Changes in the water system. Flooding is an example of that. As we continue our urbanization at amazing rates right now, we have more loss of life, more examples of waterborne disease, be it cholera or just simple diarrhea diseases, also property damage, and changes in what I call the terrasphere, which includes the surface and the subsurface. Roads are an example we're going to dive into in a little bit, and how they change things at a large scale that can actually end up being almost planetary in nature, from erosion to land use, changes in the diet, deforestation, et cetera. Okay, Alia and I have lots of conversations, and I actually heard this first quote at a conference in Geneva in probably 2005, and a person says to me with a straight face, there's no such thing as a natural disaster, and all disasters are social constructs. And I had a bit of a fit at this point because I just returned from Aceh province in Indonesia, which was hit by an unprecedented tsunami that killed 250,000 people. And here's something like this seemed like a bit of a pedantic argument, but they were right. Because of that idea of considering vulnerability, if we were really determined to save loss of life and property, we could do it if we want to put the resources to it. However, we choose to make decisions on that lead to this. But an example of a disaster or a hazard that has an impact, if a volcano erupts somewhere in the Kuril Islands in the North Pacific, and there's nobody around to hear it or to feel the impacts, is it a disaster? And the answer is no. So you can have a hazard event without becoming a disaster. It's only when humans get into the mix that it becomes a disaster. Arguably, there's ecosystems that can be impacted by large impacts, but we're not concerned with that in our lab right now. Okay, I want to take you to Indonesia, to Aceh province. In 2005, I was part of the first United Nations team that went into Aceh province, which was kind of ground zero for the 2004 tsunami. We were there about 3 weeks after the tsunami hit. We were the first scientific team to go in there. We waited until they got basic services back online and the initial response phase of the disaster was over. And the pilot of our plane recognized there were a bunch of scientists on it. So he actually flew us up the entire coastline of Aceh. And it was quite remarkable to see. For about 100 miles of the coastline, everything was gone within about a mile or two of the coastline. Everything was flat. And we saw images like this over and over and over again. Maybe there was a mosque standing, but most buildings were flattened to rubble. And in Aceh, the whole disaster killed about 250,000 people. In Aceh province alone, there were about 125,000 people that passed away. This is a village we visited about 2 months after the tsunami. This is Glebrook village, had a population of about 9,000 people. And this village, about 6,000 people died. Come into this image, you can see a grid work of streets coming in. You see how everything in this area was completely flattened away. The scale of this disaster was kind of unimaginable. So again, is this a social construct? No, but we can fight about that later. So we're there about 3 weeks after the tsunami, and I was taking a break from the work we were doing, digging up sediment. And I met this guy, and he's smiling from ear to ear. And I said, you just saw your world rocked upside down. Why are you smiling? And he says, well, it's funny because during the disaster, and I had a video camera, I was taking interviews with people. And he says, if I had had that camera, I'd be a rich man right now, because he was out on a boat as a fisherman and he saw the ocean wasn't acting right. So instead of going back inland, he actually went offshore. He was able to ride out the first wave of the tsunami, saw it actually come in and hit his village, and then went back out. And he took his boat and went back in, didn't realize there's a second wave coming. So he came back in, the second wave comes in, he says, oh crap, shimmies up a coconut tree, and the coconut tree, I'm gonna step away from the microphone, sorry, Zoom. The water was hitting about 20 meters west. Everything around it was only water. He said if he had a video camera at that moment, he would have been a rich man, because he would have had some amazing footage and nobody else would have believed. But he was very happy to be alive, as were his buddies, which kind of gave me hope in the face of disaster. So when I show this next picture and you see me having a cup of coffee, smiling and laughing with people I met at a coffee shop, there's a lot of laughter in these areas, and it was kind of a strange way, a beautiful situation. But my colleagues were out digging holes in the mud. I found myself getting distracted, I would say, by other opportunities. I talked to people and talked about people, how they survived, what their stories were. And I think it was kind of cathartic for them to get to express their situation. So we drank a lot of coffee. Remind you, this is in Sumatra, which is one of the places for coffee. So a lot of coffee was had here and a lot of good conversations. But that really started shifting my way, I think, about my work, from just trying to understand disasters as by only understanding the science, to really getting to understand the complexity of how these geophysical impacts actually impact people and communities. So I'll take you to Sumatra. This is the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. The earthquake that happened in 2004 was a magnitude 9.2, tremendously huge event, unimaginably large event. By contrast, the one that hit Haiti in 2010, I believe, was a 7.2, and it's a logarithmic scale. So this is about 10,000 times more energy, if I did my math right, released in this event than there was in Haiti, for example. Not many people know about it, but there's actually a magnitude 8.6, which is another really big earthquake that happened a year later, rather. But that didn't make as much news because it wasn't nearly as bad as the big one that happened before. We're going to take you to Simelu Island. It's a small island offshore, population of about 90,000 people. This island was about 30 kilometers south, about 20 miles south of the epicenter of this earthquake. The earthquake was so powerful, it lifted the entire coastline up 3 meters, about the height of this room, in a matter of about 2 seconds. So what you're looking at here was coral reef that prior to the earthquake would have been actually under about a meter's worth of water. And then it was uplifted instantly by the power of the earthquake. So this guy, fisherman also in this area, standing on what would have been coral reef underwater, maybe a month prior to this. So on Simelu Island, at the time's population, I think about 80,000 people. All of 7 people died during the 2004 earthquake and tsunami. And we thought that was kind of remarkable statistics. We started asking why. People after person after person after family came around with a very similar story about survival. This young family we met in a town, I can't remember the name of the town right now, survived because they felt the ground shake. They very calmly got their babies together. They found some old people in the village, and they walked to a pre-assigned meeting place that I'll show you a picture of in a second, because they had indigenous knowledge about this event. Turns out there was a story that got passed to the village from her grandmother, that in about 100 years prior, there's a big earthquake and tsunami. There was no earthquake and tsunami. It happened. And there's a wedding that was happening on the beach. And in Sumatra, when they do their weddings, they kind of borrow a bunch of gold and jewelry and crowns. It's very heavy outfit, but earthquake and tsunami happened, and unfortunately came in, and the whole village was down by the beach and wiped out the entire village. And they found the bride in a tree, palm tree, 20 meters above sea level, and she was not alive. And that story really stuck with this young mother when she was a child, and she remembered that story. So the story was, if the ground starts shaking, don't panic, just get your family, get your kids, and go to the pre-assigned meeting place. So her village, forgive me, let's see if I can find my pointer here. Her village was an area down this little beautiful bay right here. And the pre-assigned meeting place was there. on a headland where there's another village just to the other side of the image here. And both villages kind of converged on there. They already had infrastructure set up. They had bamboo poles up there. All they had to do was put up some tarps and get some bamboo leaves and that sort of thing to set up a village. By the time we got there, about 3 weeks after the tsunami, they had schools, housing, even a little restaurant set up in this place. And nobody in their villages died because they had stories. Power of stories in these disasters can be truly remarkable. I mentioned Sharial here also because he has his stories also. Sharial is a crab fisherman in Banda Aceh. He's been there his whole life. Funny, but he was a really interesting guy. He invited us to his house for a party that night. Turns out he also does Achenese rock and roll. At the time of the earthquake and tsunami, there was actually a insurgency going on where the Achenese were rebelling against the Indonesian government because they wanted to have a more strict form of Sharia law in the area. So this war was going on. Some people thought that the tsunami was punishment for this war, but other people thought it could have been a lot worse. Hard to imagine it being worse had they not been doing the war. So again, the stories were interesting. But Sharial had interesting stories because he knew the land. As a crab fisherman, he understood how the environment in his area works. Now, this is an image of Banda Aceh immediately after the tsunami, taken by a US military plane that was surveying the area. This is probably about 4 kilometers inland, so maybe 2 or 3 miles inland, where most things were either destroyed or damaged. It's kind of unimaginable to see the amount of destruction we're talking about here. The other thing I want you to notice, it's very low-lying land. You can actually see the ocean in the back of the picture, and the tsunami went all the way through those mountains and passed through the ocean. The rest of the ocean would actually be kind of behind the photographer here. If you look at a map view of the area, that picture was taken right about just a little bit north of where that limit is on inundation limit, but that's how far the tsunami came in. You can see the 1 kilometer bar there. Everything in this area was pretty much destroyed. You can see areas where they have fish ponds as industry in this area. We actually went back and were able to find some old maps of the area. It turns out this area circled here in blue was mapped as wetlands before. We think it probably was mangroves back in the day. And Sharial actually confirmed that this is perfect mangrove habitat. And had they actually had better mangroves there, his crab fishery would be better because there'd be more nursery services available. But with urbanization in this area, they came through and put a lot of housing in this area, cleared out the mangroves, put in fish ponds and the like, but also put a lot of houses out there, which is why we had over 100,000 deaths in Banda Aceh. So Sharial took me to this place here where you can actually see the remnants of a mangrove in the foreground here that was destroyed by the tsunami. And then you can see behind that kind of a thicket of little seedlings. This is a classic thing that we saw repeated over and over again in the area where NGOs would come in and say, well, mangroves are good for the ecosystem. He was laughing and told me to come here because they planted the wrong species in the wrong place. So they took what they thought were mangroves, hired a bunch of widows that were survivors of the tsunami, asked for lots of donations from the West, planted 1,000 seedlings in this area and left. And they all died. And Sharial is saying, like, just ask me, just think about it before you do what you do. He also pointed me to an area. Oh, give me. After the tsunami happened, a lot of money came into the area, and with a lot of money, sometimes engineering projects come in. And while I'm not opposed to engineering, I think we need engineers for all kinds of things like this building. Sometimes ecosystems can do a better job. They built a seawall in the area to kind of both protect the area from future impacts, but also to kind of act as a dike so you can actually increase more fish ponds and get more people to come into the coastal zone. I'm also not against that. I think it's important for people to be able to earn their livelihoods in the coastal zone. And according to our research, we were the first group to figure out that the last tsunami in this area happened 600 years prior. So they've got probably another 600 years they can develop this coastline and live versus not gaining the benefits from taking advantage of the ecosystem services the coastal system provides here. However, Sharial would argue that if you were able to do the same kind of protection with mangroves, you'd have more benefit, it would be cheaper, and it would last longer and be more sustainable. This is Banda Aceh in 2004, prior to the tsunami. You can see the urbanization creeping out into the coastal zone there. This is after the tsunami, where everything in that kind of brownish area was pretty much destroyed. And if we come back in 2022, you can see urbanization even growing more because of a lot of the money that came into the area after the disaster. And if you go to the areas where the NGOs didn't go, you have the right kind of habitat for mangroves to grow, you have natural mangrove regeneration. You can see a nice diverse ecosystem here, and everything regrew here naturally. This area was wiped completely flat in 2004 also. This is maybe, this is 2009. Sharial knows things. Okay, switching gears here. This is Morby. Morby was our guide and fixer when we were in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. We were part of a team that was looking at how different organizations communicated information about the disaster across different sectors. And Morby, as you can tell, is quite wealthy. Turns out that he is the grandson of Baby Doc Duvalier's security guard. So he comes from a well-established and well-connected family. He had a very nice SUV that he drove us around in, and he spoke English-ish. This is a famous picture, satellite image of the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And it's kind of as a story of two different dictators in the area that kind of ruled the area. On the one side, on the Haiti side, the Duvaliers, Baby Doc and Papa Doc Duvalier. And on the other side was Rafael Trujillo. And Trujillo was a particularly nasty flavored dictator. And in the 1930s, if I remember correctly, there's a massacre that the Trujillo government committed against Haitians on the border. And part of the reason for this massacre was that the environmental degradation that was happening at the border, they were scapegoating the Haitians on it. The second reason for it is Trujillo's brother owned a liquefied natural gas company. And they said, look, you're not gonna cut down any more trees or we'll kill you. And then you will buy gas from my brother, classic kleptocracy. But it kept the Dominican side of the border significantly more green than the Haitian side. Haiti has been something like 96 or 98% deforested at this point, and because of a lot of things, because of the damage that was done by the Duvaliers. I want to compare two earthquakes now. We go back to no such thing as a natural disaster, and if you put the right infrastructure or level of development in, you can actually reduce the impact. So I want to compare two earthquakes. In 1989, magnitude 7.1 earthquake hit the San Francisco Bay Area. San Francisco Bay Area has about a 7 million population. In San Francisco proper, about 6,000 people per square kilometer. 63 people died in this event, so it's pretty big for the United States. The GDP at the time of the Bay Area was about $300 billion. And this is before Silicon Valley was really taking off, it was really getting going, but it's still a significant US city. And in San Francisco alone, there are 42 fire stations, thinking about resilience. Let's look at Haiti, magnitude 7 earthquake. The entire country has 10 million people. In Port-au-Prince, there's almost 30,000 people per square kilometer. Talk about that in a minute. The GDP in Haiti is about $11 billion. I was surprised it was that high. And in all of Haiti, there are 2 fire stations. How operable they are is debatable. So I want to back this up for a second. I also forgot to mention, we have here, the red lines are faults. And the faults are the reason why the bay is there, and the faults would generate the earthquakes. So there are actual economic benefits from having a safe harbor in this area. I took Port-au-Prince and I rotated it 90 degrees so you get an idea of it's the same kind of bay. It's a safe harbor for hurricanes. In the Hades example, safe harbor from Pacific storms in the San Francisco Bay Area example. Okay, I want to take you back to the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. The Haitian Revolution was kind of the beginning of the downfall of Haiti. Prior to the Haitian Revolution, I think if I remember correctly, Haiti was responsible for about 1/3 of France's GDP. You talk about Haiti being the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't back in the 18th century. It has been because after the first successful slave revolt, France went through and put in a fine to Haiti to discourage other slave revolts that to this day, I believe, Haiti is still paying off. So they've been kind of fallen into a debt trap, and they were never able to get out of that trap for a number of reasons. It also resulted in tremendous environmental degradation. If you come from a plantation economy and all of a sudden you're free, then the last thing you want to do is kind of be collective again, but you want to go out and get your own land. That kind of results in a classic tragedy of the commons, where people end up cutting down a lot more resources than they necessarily needed to. This picture I took in above Port-au-Prince in 2010. I found a remarkable picture because it does talk about the indigenous knowledge that people have. They recognize the value of the tree in maintaining the soil and keeping down erosion, but they also need to eat. So they chip away at the tree just enough to get fuel to cook their food, but not to kill the tree, because they need the ecosystem services from the tree. That's the level of poverty that people are dealing with in the countryside, and that's the level of poverty that drove people to seek out economic opportunity in the capital. If you look at the hillsides in Haiti, they're largely denuded. As a geologist, I see this kind of scene. It doesn't look right for the tropics. It looks like something different. And you look at the river in the lower left-hand corner of this image, it's got big boulders in that. You almost never see that in the tropics. So there's something really bizarre going on here. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I want to be aware of time. But a town called Paradis, there were 7 people that died from a tsunami here. I think this wasn't the right kind of earthquake from a tsunami, but that's what happened during the 2010 earthquake. I trace out the coastline here. But what happened is during the earthquake, a large section of coastline simply fell away. And when that happened, it dropped into the ocean, and that generated a wave that was in turn killed the people that died in this area. If we look at how rapidly the coastline has been prograding, if you have lots of sediment coming out of rivers quickly, it doesn't get a chance to really get nice and consolidated or strong. So during an earthquake, it shakes and falls loose. If we trace out the coastline over time, we can see different areas of growth and rates of growth in the area that can be related to different times of economic growth. So the more stress there are in the economic system, the more people are more likely to cut down trees and damage the environment, which results in more erosion and more sedimentation happening in the coastline. I put that out there because I'm a geologist and I need to geek out on this stuff a little bit, but it's kind of an interesting story about how actually economics and politics can play into the actual physical and geographical environment. One more image of this. This is the coastline just to the west of Port-au-Prince. Port-au-Prince is there on the right-hand side of this image. Keep your eyes in the circled area. We found a map from 1702, 1730. If you look at the areas circled, those are bays in 1730. And if we go back to the other image, they're actually deltas now. So we're talking about 30 or 40 kilometers of coastline been built out in a short amount of time because of all the erosion that's happened. So Haiti's wealth and their soil wealth was completely eroded and deposited in the ocean following the revolution in late 18th century. Okay. One more case study I want to show you. We're going to Nepal, where we've been working for the last almost 10 years. China has been developing the Belt and Road Initiative. This is an area where they're trying to get goods and services from China to the rest of the world. And a lot of us, when we were kind of growing up, we were watching China annex Tibet, and we think, why do they want Tibet? It's just a bunch of Buddhists up there. It's a desert. What's their interest in this area? Well, that represents an overland route to Europe, where they can deliver goods and services by train and by truck throughout Central Asia and even getting into south parts of South Asia. And of course, that flows money back to China. Another part of Belt and Road Initiative is actually an overseas route, which tries to get goods and services to Africa. What I'm concerned about is actually thinking about what stands between China and 1.4 billion potential customers in India. And that would be the kingdom of Nepal, well, former kingdom of Nepal. I'm going to show you a video that I took. I think this was in 2018, maybe. This is the main highway right now, but the only highway that was open after the earthquake between India and China through Nepal. The main highway. And this is a few years after the earthquake. We had passed along the way a set of trucks that were parked bumper to bumper, literally bumper to bumper. There was about 1 kilometer long, coming up to the Chinese border to get goods from there, and then driving back down to Nepal and other areas in South Asia. This goes on for a while. You can see the trucks that are parked here waiting to get their goods from Chinese border. Zoom in here quickly to see, nod to America there, these colorful trucks. But you get the idea. This is a pretty rough road, and to develop this road would be a tremendous boon for trade happening between Nepal, China, and India. So I'm going to dive a little bit into roads in Nepal. Road development in Nepal has really taken off in the last few years. We'll talk about why that's the case. But with that comes a lot of changes to the environment in these rural villages that were previously connected by only footpaths. Okay, so why do people build roads? This is kind of development 101. People want access to healthcare, they want access to education, they want access to markets, social networks, ideas and technology exchange, fuel, food, etc. Excuse me. There are also disadvantages when you put in a road to these areas, but clearly advantages should outweigh the disadvantages. But they tend to carve these informal roads in with a guy with a bulldozer, and they do it during the dry season. When the increasingly intense monsoon season comes around, it washes out the roads, causing landslides, which kill hundreds of people in Nepal a year. It also brings land use changes. Now that you have access to markets, are you incentivized for taking out more forest to put in more pasture land or more farmland for food? It impacts the water systems. People after people we talk to in these villages say, yeah, after the road went in, our springs started to dry up. Can also affect endangered species. We were lucky enough to see a snow leopard in an area that was recently brought a road into, but the snow leopard was eating some cattle that was in a high pasture that was there because of the road. Now they can get meat to market back in the city. They have incentive to raise cattle in the highlands. So it's complex. Infectious disease transmission. That last video I showed you where the trucks were parked, they have to wait there for a while. So impromptu village set up there. And in that village, of course, there's lots of truckers, there's TVs, there's places where you can get cell phone cards. There's a bar, of course, and there's also prostitution. And STD rates and AIDS are on the increase in this area as well. And also with benefits of food, there's also a lot of crap food that comes to these areas. So we're starting to see first world non-communicable diseases arise in these villages, from obesity to heart disease, diabetes. They're popping in these villages where previously they didn't have enough calories. Now they've got too much calories, but they're low nutritional value. Okay, quickly about roads and landslides. I mentioned the monsoon comes through and there's different ways that we can get landslides. These are some examples that we have. We can show you pictures of what these features look like when they happen in the field. Debris flows happen. The road itself can actually fail almost down to bedrock. We can get some failures that happen up above the roads, even on vegetated slopes. And we can get bedrock landslides where it actually goes in and breaks out the bedrock and causes massive rock falls. The scale of this one is kind of hard to imagine, but you can see houses down here. This building is probably 5 stories tall. So it's really quite a massive event that you can see there. If we take this apart a little bit more, as a geoscientist, my first inclination is, well, these events are got to be driven by just changes in climate. That's the first easy thing. You have big rainfalls make big landslides. So here's an image of what rainfall looks like over time. And you can see it fluctuating a little bit with things like El Nino cycling. There's a natural rhythmic side to it. So we expect, well, let's see if we see more landslides that occur in these rainier years. So this is an average of the monsoon. You can see it kind of fluctuating a little bit there. These are the landslide occurrences, the number of landslides. So sometimes you see spikes in landslides in dry years. Sometimes you see spikes in landslides in wet years. So it's really not an even correlation. So you can't, of course, get to causation in this. So what's going on here? Well, you can see the climate is the wetness is generally increasing slowly, but on average, not so much. But the landslides are actually going up quite quickly in this area. I put in here in 2006, there was the end of a Maoist insurgency that happened at this time. Things started changing right around that time. Prior to that time, there was about 60, 70 landslides per year. After that time, doubled to 140 landslides per year on average. If we look at road construction during this time, you can see that after the Maoist insurgency ends, we actually have an uptick in road construction as more foreign investment comes back into the country. We see that investment going into roads to help develop the countryside. We actually see pleasantly a drop in deaths associated with that. I think the overall vulnerability of the country went down after the government started getting its feet back on board. However, we're starting to see that the number of deaths are increasing now that they've kind of leveled off and coming back up again. Okay, so if we look at it now and consider how roads are impacting rural villages, this is part of our research we actually started here at Duke University. We can see that roads cause things like air pollution, not only from dust, but also diesel fumes and other aromatic hydrocarbons that can make people sick. At the same time, it's bringing in LPG or liquefied petroleum gas to villages that previously relied on biofuels. So prior to the road being in this area, they would have been burning either dung from cows or bison, water buffalo, or biofuels in terms of wood inside. So inside air quality has actually gone up quite a bit because of the presence of LPG gas. I mentioned before, it brings food. These are fresh vegetables that are being brought in from India and the Terai area. Unfortunately, that also undermines local markets for food because they can grow food cheaper in scale down below. And also prepackaged low nutrient, high calorie things like ramen noodles, cookies, and soda are coming to these areas. Life-saving medicines are also coming to this area. This woman Her son has been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder after the earthquake in 2015, and he relies on antidepressants, which at $1 a day are really stressing her budget. It also brings alcohol to the area. They have their local brew in this area, which is pretty deadly, and arguably the stuff that's made in a more of a controlled environment might be less unhealthy, we'll say. Okay, this is the backbone of Alia's research. She's interested in how, being from the Himalaya, how is this climate change or climate change plus land use changes causing changes in health and well-being. She's particularly interested in mental health as a focus of her area. So we went to Nepal, excuse me, last summer and participated in a series of focus group discussions and interviews with people to figure out what kind of health and problems are they having and what do they think are the drivers of these health problems. We're partnering with a group called Karma Flights, which once or twice or maybe 3 times a year, depending how much money they can raise, will will put on these planetary health camps. They'll actually set up for 2 days and everybody from surrounding villages can come and get free healthcare. We're able to get data from these camps to see how the different illnesses are laying up. You can see a lot of problems with joint and muscle pain. The ones underlined here are things we can probably relate to global change of some kind, but that's the work we're trying to do. How we untangle these things from what are the causes of climate change impacting things like respiratory illness, for example, versus changes in the roads and the dust and the other pollutants that are coming up there. That's the hard work we need to do, and that's what we'll be working on for the next 20 or 30 years. Okay, I'm gonna stop now with the different case studies and start focusing back to solutions as we wrap up. Take a deep breath also, and remember, we do live on the planet. It's a beautiful planet to live on, and it's changing rapidly. We want to start aiming ourselves towards just solutions, solutions that are helping the people that mostly need help. We need to think about the different parts of this equation that we're writing out here and who can do what, where, to what end. If you consider the Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned, this falls into not only in the developing world, but also here in the United States. Number 1, climate action certainly impacts the hazard. Things like consumption, production, these ecosystem services that both oceans and forests provide can reduce our hazard in different ways as they act as buffers and also decrease our vulnerability or increase our resilience if we can get certain products after disaster that can help us survive. We do need, to consider reducing things like poverty, hunger, increasing our education, et cetera. Then we start getting towards the solution side on this exposure and adaptation place, thinking about buoying up our healthcare systems and also coming up with clean energy solutions to reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And then considering a whole suite of solution space in these SDGs that will help us think about how can we focus these ideas in ways that don't make the whole situation worse. Let this one sit for a second while I get a sip of water because my students call this one psychedelic effervescence. But if you look at it, you can start seeing what's going on here, where you have wealthy countries represented by larger circles and poorer countries in terms of GDP in the smaller circles, and different kinds of disasters over time, different times that is. On the vertical axis, we have number of deaths, and on the horizontal axis, we have economic losses. The dogma that exists out there is that during any given disaster in a poorer country, you're gonna have high deaths, high mortality, but low economic losses because there's not that many assets exposed. And in wealthier countries, you're gonna have higher economic losses with lower deaths. Which one of these hazards, the different colors, is kind of going opposite that trend? This is not a rhetorical question. We're calling this extreme temperature. This is both heat waves and cold waves, but yes, extreme temperature. You can see really surprisingly high deaths associated with extreme temperature. Those big 3 dots there are heat waves in Northern Europe. I think it was 2010 heat wave in Northern Europe, killed something like 50,000 people. You don't hear about that because it's not a terribly visual disaster. So the news it's also kind of over a long period of time. It doesn't really make the news like other ones, but heat is coming for us and it's causing a lot of damage, especially in the developing world. The other one that bucks the trend, anybody want to take a quick guess? One other hazard that would be opposite what you expect? Anybody from California here? Fire, exactly. Fires in California and Australia cause lots of death and economic losses, where in the developing world, it's not a problem because people aren't stupid. Sorry, California. Okay, here in North Carolina, we can see a pretty significant trend with hospitalizations associated with high heat days. So you can see, pretty much a 1-1 correlation here in summer of 2021, where during very hot days, we have more hospitalizations. We're working on a project, it's trying to define how extreme weather events here in North Carolina, here in Durham, track to what kind of injuries. So if you have a snowstorm, for example, do the emergency rooms find there's more broken wrists because people slip and fall? Or if there's a heat wave, do people have heart attacks? There is a thunderstorm. Is there more carbon monoxide poisoning because people go and put their generators on in a poorly ventilated space? These are all questions we're trying to get to that we don't know the answers to. So our first thing is trying to find what constitutes an extreme event. Here in North Carolina, we might have a 90-degree day. It's like, not so bad. 90-degree day in Chicago could kill 1,000 people. A 90-degree day in Phoenix, Arizona is time to put on a sweater. So we're trying to make sure we understand what constitutes these. My student, Ishani Pandukar, has done this analysis showing that even though daytime temperatures in North Carolina over time are not increasing that fast, nighttime temperatures are. And nighttime is where often people seek a refuge. If you're poor, you can't afford air conditioning, it doesn't cool off at night, you're going to have problems. Those problems can accumulate. Redlining, important issue I think many people in this room are familiar with here in Durham. Student in the master's program at Nicholas School produced this map. It shows areas of urban heat island in the thatched area, and the red areas are the areas that are redlined by the Housing Homeowner Loan Corporation back in the 1930s. And the yellow areas, to this day, we still see adverse health impacts by people that live in these redlined areas. Almost 100 years later, the legacy lives on because of lack of investment in infrastructure and housing in this area. We hope to do, that'll tie over to our work in Nepal also, is define a series of climate emergency sensitive healthcare conditions. These are, as I mentioned, first we need to do is find out what constitutes an extreme weather event. Once we identify extreme weather events, we're going to get records from the Duke University emergency departments, figure out what are people coming in with, complaints they're coming in with, and also from the emergency medical system here in Durham County. We'll then analyze those data, try and figure out who, when, where, and what kind of injuries are happening. And then eventually we want to get to solutions. And this is where our space comes in. The biggest partner, the biggest asset we have in defining solutions, we are communities. They probably know what's needed already, and they just need a little bit more ammunition. So we hope to give them the kind of data. So we're already partnering at the very beginning of this grant with communities. We've literally just got our funding for this grant a week ago that came through. So we're getting rolling on it just now. We've already had meetings with community organizations to try to figure out who is suffering in their areas. We also plan to work with hospitals, rural clinics, and we are partnering also with the National Healthcare System in Brazil to understand how rural clinics in the Amazonia area are going to be prepared for climate change when it comes for them. Okay, last few slides here, then I'll open up to questions. I took this picture in Singapore a few years back. This is an answer to the problem of heat. We can put air conditioners in everybody's house. It wouldn't be too expensive. However, this adds to the urban heat island effect by actually pumping more heat into the outside urban environment. And two, every one of these air conditioners in Singapore is fueled by hydrocarbon fueled electricity. Here in North Carolina, just over half of our energy is generated by hydrocarbons, so we're doing better, but we can't put air conditioners in different people's houses and expect things to get better over the long term. We got some seed funding a couple of years ago to try and look at geothermal. I mentioned geothermal at the beginning. You can actually use geothermal energy for both heating and cooling, and it's carbon neutral. So it's got a lot of potential here. So we got some seed funding to do experimental hole over on Central Campus here at Duke. This is important because after Hurricane Ida, 17 of the deaths of people that died in Hurricane Ida in New Orleans were related to power outages. It's 6 from carbon monoxide poisoning and 11 deaths from excess heat after the power went out following the event. In North Carolina, we have about 3,000 emergency department visits a year, about 250 deaths per year due to heat. And as it gets worse, we're expecting that number to go up. If we can get geothermal heating and cooling, we can get a scalable solution, something we can scale up throughout the East Coast of the United States, even to Western Europe and Western Africa. We have distributed energy. It's no longer requiring a big grid to support, electric grid to support local solutions. It's reliable, it doesn't break down. as much as a finicky electric grid, and it's carbon neutral for the most part. The geology, I'm a geologist, I had to throw some geology in here like I promised. The area is conducive to this because we sit in what they call the Durham Basin, which is some relatively soft rock that's not too expensive to drill through. If we can get down 2 kilometers in this basin, we can get to temperatures that with the right technology, we can actually run district heating and cooling to support an entire campus or an entire neighborhood with 1 or 2 wells. But we're not there yet. We did drill a hole back in September, October this past year. We only got down 100 meters, but we're applying for more money to drill a deeper hole later this year. Okay, wrapping things up. This is my actual last slides. Excuse me. So at PlanetLab, we are working to understand how humans are impacting the planet in ways that are compromising our own health and well-being, and also what we can do about it. The framework I presented here tells us what each one of us in this room can do to contribute to this problem and how we can come together and figure out what these solutions look like. Alia and her PhD work, I kind of can compare her to a conductor of an orchestra. She doesn't need to know how to play each instrument, but she has to know what each instrument does and how they all come together in this project. So that's what we're trying to do in the PlanetLab. It's truly interdisciplinary, and her skill that she'll come out of her PhD with is to be an interdisciplinarian, which is something new and different, which is, I'm super happy that she's taken on the courage to do that. And that's my last slide. I can say that most of this work would not be possible were it not for the students. And these are a list of the students that have been proud enough to step up and join the PlanetLab and help us with a variety of different projects, what I can ask questions about, be it lemurs in Madagascar or air pollution in Nepal. But the students are really doing simply an extraordinary job of doing the heavy lifting in this project. So thank you for your time and your attention.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Khalees. I'm a senior public policy major here at Duke. And my question is, so I guess the solution for like geothermal is posed as like a technical solution, but like what social change do we need in order to like facilitate a society that doesn't produce as much, or like to address the problem as well, so that like we're not only relying on geothermal?
That's excellent. I mean, answer that question, we'll share the Nobel Prize, I think. It's an excellent question. It's particularly acute right now in Durham. Right now, Durham is going through a gentrification like nobody else has seen. And what's happening is people in the neighborhoods that were traditionally these red line and mostly Black neighborhoods in the city, and also not quite as wealthy as some of the other neighborhoods, are being pushed out. And this is occurring at a staggering rate. And you go through eastern and southern parts of Durham, and you see these massive houses that are popping up between much more modest homes. What's the social solutions to this? I've got a bunch of ideas on that. Understand, I've been living in Asia for about the last decade. One thing that we noticed with the heat waves, for example, this rarely happens in Asia and also in countries that are more developing because they have stronger family networks. So here in the United States, I mean, the one thing that Alia pointed out to me is, as Americans and as Westerners, we tend to be awfully mobile. Like, imagine most of us are probably not from Durham in this room. We've traveled far from home. We've left our families behind, et cetera. I was living in Singapore when my parents were back here in North Carolina. That doesn't happen in most places in the world. And if, God forbid, there was a power outage or something at the old folks' home where my dad was in Greensboro, I wouldn't have been able to do anything about that from Singapore. Were I here and was he living with me, I could have been better able to care for him. Not that the people there didn't care for him, but that family connection and communal connection is a big deal. The family I mentioned from Aceh that survived the tsunami. Aceh, as I mentioned, also is a very strong religious community. It's where Islam first came to Indonesia, and it still maintains Sharia law to a certain degree. And it's we say Sharia law, just for people who don't know, it's not like the stuff we hear about in the media. It's just really trying to live by what Islam tenets they really believe in. But in doing so, on this island, because it's a rural island, a very tight community, most people go to pray 5 times a day, or at least once a day. Most people are going to go to the mosque, and the whole community kind of goes at the same time with a call to prayer, and you start seeing who's not there, right? Oh, what happened to old Mrs. So-and-so? Oh, she fell and broke her hip last week. Okay, let's go check on her because she wasn't at mosque. So sometimes even religious structures can come in and actually reduce your vulnerability to different disasters, as do family structures. So I believe those different social systems, if we continue being aware of those social systems and the power they bring, especially I think the answer is community. Whether it's your family community or your found family or your religious community or your academic community, you gotta look out for each other. And I think that's really critical for reducing the risks of some of these different disasters. And the last thing I'll mention also, the first responders for every disaster are your neighbors. So we often rely on government or the military or somebody to come in and help us out, but really it's our neighbors to help us out. So the more we know about each other, the closer we are together, the better we are to look out for each other. Good question, though. I appreciate that.
Hi, Jackson Ewing, Nicholas Institute. How do you, Brian, and your colleagues at PlanetLab deal with the tensions that exist between the different solution sets and the pillars that you map out? I mean, what comes to mind is the various kinds of ecological decline that could come from the scaling up of renewable energy, for example. But at the same time, we have to compare that scaling up against the alternative, which is a continuation or expansion of fossil-based energy. You could create similar tensions in transportation sectors, for example. How do you go about thinking about that, understanding it, coming up with solutions that that manage those trade-offs and come to some kind of best outcome as you see it?
Thank you for that question, Jackson. That's an excellent question because we've chosen the approach we're chosen. I'm not saying it's right, but it's what we're doing is working at small scale grassroots level. In doing so, I considered the work we want to do here in Durham with working with communities to consider how these extreme weather is impacting our communities. We want to say, okay, here's the data, here's what's happening. Let's come to solutions together. Now, if we empower communities to do that and understand what the problems are, how are these things interacting with each other, and what are the pluses and minuses of these different things, they get to make the decision on what they want to do so long as they're informed. So I go back to the Nepal example. We're dealing with these communities, they're thrilled to have a road, finally. So the road came in after the 2015 earthquake with some more development money that came in. Prior to that, they would have had to walk, I'm going to guess, about 3 days down to the main road to get to access these goods and services. They had been living on a diet of mostly rice and dal and lentils for most of their time, maybe some potatoes, maybe some milk or yogurt products. All of a sudden they get access to products like ramen noodles and cookies and fresh vegetables from down below. That's a big excitement. So how do they navigate that space? Well, that's up to them to figure out. If we want to, they say, well, the farmers are saying we need some kind of way to keep our own farmers afloat. We're getting overwhelmed by these vegetables that are coming in. So then we're talking with the NGO partner working with to support organic agriculture in this area to say, how can we encourage different markets to evolve there based on your needs for the community? So the tensions are always there. And what Ali is trying to do in her PhD is how do you unravel them and then prioritize the pluses and minuses of different parts of the system, their intention. But then once you kind of figure out the data behind that, let the communities decide. How you scale that up to these large scale questions, I don't know. And we'll have to talk about that more because I know that's the scale at which you're thinking. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question regarding some of the readings we had for today, and I think you briefly mentioned it a little bit. And I know it may not be your area of expertise, but since you've been in places where you've seen the effects of natural disaster in mental health, I would really appreciate if you can abundant that, especially coming from a person who has gone through it and try to explain to other people what it's like and how even the most minute thing can kind of trigger that trauma, and people don't really understand or think you're maybe exaggerating. How can we make awareness more proliferate and so people understand and like be in someone else's shoes and how little things can trigger those kind of reactions?
I know you came through Maria and the hurricanes that hit in Puerto Rico, and it's devastating. And to go through trauma like this, I'm trying not to be snarky in my response, because and to sticking with the theme of this, there's been a remarkable line of research that's come out very recently about how the healthcare system is recognizing that Black people feel pain. And it really it's really disturbing. It took a doctor who was, I think she was a doctor from Atlanta who was having a baby, and she's like, I'm in pain. And they're like, no, you're not, you're fine. And she's like, no, I'm a physician. I know what I'm talking about. I'm in pain. I need some medicine. Like, nah, toughen it out. So she eventually got what she needed, but it turns out statistically that Black people are often underprescribed things like pain medication when it comes to this. Similarly with mental health, people in the developing world, they go through so much stuff anyways, they can take it. They're tough. It's not a problem there like it is in us snowflakey Western society. What's happened in recent years, I moved to Singapore first in 2013, and I saw this evolution happening just in that short 10-year period. And it sounds kind of like a weak answer, but you mentioned, you gave yourself the answers, raising awareness, but having these conversations and putting a light on and saying, it's okay that we do this, because especially in the Black community here in the United States, and especially in Asian culture, mental health is stigmatized. And until we figure out ways to normalize it, which is happening through conversations and shining a lighting on it, and unfortunately, the more people are exposed to it, the more we recognize it's a problem. That's the way we're going to get through it. So in Nepal, for example, we're trying to partner, as we're doing these health camps. Last year's health camp did not include much mental health issues, but we're actually bringing some mental health specialists out to this camp. We're adding to our survey questions about, there's some very simple indicators of PTSD or anxiety that we can ask at the intake. They may not recognize, oh no, I'm fine. I'm not depressed or anything. I just can't sleep. And I found I really jump at kind of these little things, So these are issues we can start dealing with, but it's coming around now. And the fact that there is an organization in Kathmandu that's dedicated to rural mental health is revolutionary. And it's only come about in the last 5 years or so. So it's going to take time, but I don't know not being a mental health professional myself, I don't know exactly what the answer is to that, but I can tell you that as it becomes more normalized in societies, that's when people start getting treatment. And I can't tell you how thankful I am for that, especially when you see how it's impacted the Black community here in the United States. And I'm just gonna tell you a quick personal story, but mental health is something in my family. It's been an issue. And I think about my father who grew up in Greensboro, in a segregated Greensboro. I can't imagine the stress that generation went through. I mean, he was the first Black person to attend North Carolina State University's engineering program. And being the only Black person there coming from a segregated school, that's a level of stress that I've not had to face in my life. And that has long-going impacts on that. So it's something we need to focus on, especially in our communities, especially in communities throughout, I'd say, the developing world. Thank you for that question.
Brian, I have a question from Aditya in Berkeley, who's with us on Zoom. Thank you for your lecture, Dr. McAdoo. I wanted to ask whether Indigenous knowledge has had or can have any role in averting disaster risks in the global North.
It's funny. I was an undergraduate here at Duke, and I remember my roommate was from Los Angeles, and we actually had a snowfall here. And you know I'm going with this, don't you? So he went outside, and I think he might have had a sweatshirt on or something, but didn't have a hat on or anything. He comes back in, he's soaking wet, and he's freezing cold, and he actually caught a cold, of course. It's like, well, you always see people on TV with the snow and the hair, and it's all fluffy, this sort of thing. Sorry, Los Angeles. I don't mean California here too much, but so that kind of, it is kind of an indigenous knowledge. The challenge we found in Banda Aceh, actually, which is analogous to I think we're going, is there's so much migration that happens that people move around so much, it's hard to develop and maintain indigenous knowledge. In our model there, one of the systems I consider vulnerable is we call knowledge systems. We lose knowledge sometimes, knowledge of space and place when we move around too much. So I believe it's a real challenge to deal with indigenous knowledge in the kind of developed world or global North scenario. The other thing that we're trying to get to, and I think this is kind of a lazy answer to your question, it's hard to know what kind of knowledge you need to preserve unless you know what the hazard is driving whatever you're trying to protect against. So right now, the work we're trying to do in identifying the hazards, which seems pretty fundamental, but nobody's done it yet. We were just down at the North Carolina State Climate Office last week. Nobody said what constitutes an extreme rainfall, wind speed, or temperature in North Carolina. NOAA says, oh, anything above 90 degrees is a heat stress. It's not the case in Phoenix, Arizona. It certainly is the case in Bangor, Maine. So if we understand what the hazards are that are driving the need for indigenous knowledge, then we can start thinking about ways of preserving or creating indigenous knowledge. But the answer to your question, I think, is stories. And the more stories we share about place and space, I think the more we'll learn about things in our areas. I'm talking about community partners. I was really shocked to learn. Every time I open my mouth and I talk to people who live with the environment, I learn something. McAdoo, shut up. Just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you're smart or anything. I said, how do people die in floods in North Carolina? And like the first answer is pretty easy. Like you see, sorry, I hope not offend anybody on Zoom here, but you see rednecks who have their big pickup trucks and they go driving through water because they see it on the commercials, the water flying out and everything. So that's a certain kind of knowledge. Is it indigenous knowledge? Well, there's an indigeneity to it, where you have a truck in a certain environment, you should be able to do it. But they don't realize it doesn't take much to actually float a truck. So people drive through flooded areas, the truck gets floated, they get moved downstream and they can die. That's a certain kind of lack of knowledge in one area. But the other threat that people have here in Durham, which I find like, wow, why didn't I think of that? I live here in the city of Durham, and I live by Ellerby Creek. And mostly along Ellerby Creek, there's a trail and parks that line the trail. Well, if you're unhoused in this area, you're living in your car, for example, you often want to park your car at a public place, a public park. It's quieter, it's tend to be a little bit darker. However, if you have a nighttime flooding event and the water rises very slowly and you're asleep in your car, that could be really hazardous for you. So that kind of like, how do you get stories out that kind of get that knowledge through is a really important question. And how do you get that to people who may be transient through our area is really a really challenging problem. Hope I answered your question, Berkeley.
I think we have one last question.
Thank you for a great talk. Liz, just for a moment. Liz Loss is from the Nicholas Institute. I'm asking you to put on your hat as a US citizen involved in a lot of these organizations trying to help, but also what you've learned from the Nepali communities. The Belt and Road, which is something that I've also been watching, has diminished a lot in the financial assistance since, say, 2017, the Belt and Road, Chinese financing. And meanwhile, the US and other Western countries are now trying to counter this with their own infrastructure investment, which is going to be much more based on private investment along with government, along with public funds. So what, from what you've seen, would make this Western investment more successful than what you saw, both from your perspective, but also from what you were hearing from the Nepali folks?
Really interesting question. Thank you for that, Liz. So in Asia, especially let's take Sri Lanka as an example. After the tsunami, this one area called Hambantota was wiped almost completely flat by the tsunami in 2004. And the government then decided they wanted to invest in this area and put a port in. And they got a loan from China that helped them develop this massive port, which is maybe a 5-hour drive from Colombo, the main city in Sri Lanka. And in doing so, they got in a debt trap. They couldn't make enough money from the place to even pay off the interest on this loan, why Sri Lanka is pretty much in crisis right now, 20 years later almost. In Nepal, I mentioned there was the Maoist insurgency. Well, actually, Maoist government is in power right now. I think there's a presidential election next week, if I remember correctly. But they've been doing a really good job of holding the Chinese off, saying, we don't want your loans. We'll take your grants. We don't want your loans. Similarly, when I was there last year, there was a very strange debate, which I didn't fully understand the nuance on, about the USAID, I believe, wanted to give a grant to Nepal of $120 million for infrastructure development. And they were hesitant to take it because they knew there'd be some strings attached to those monies. And they didn't really, maybe they weren't able to articulate. I didn't get what those strings were, but I think they're being very cautious and very wise to do this. In the United States, we just had a meeting down in Miami to kind of talk about the monies that are coming through from the various acts that have been approved lately. And the idea, the knowledge that's out there is there's stacks of money sitting on tables waiting for people to ask for it. Asking for it is a bear. And the people who most need the money do not have the capital to take the time to actually apply for the grants to get access to this money. So what I worry is going to happen is that bigger organizations, bigger companies, bigger private industry organizations are gonna be able to access this money, gain profit from it, and come up with solutions that aren't truly necessarily the best for communities. So we spent a lot of time debating. I think Ashley Ward over at Nicholas Institute is going to be putting together a meeting, a theme on the meeting next year that's going to talk about how do we get community organizations to actually access this money. So organizations that need it most, the most marginalized communities, to actually access these funds is a, you know, it's a conundrum. And if we can figure out how to crack that nut, we'll do a lot of, I believe we'll do a lot of good with that money, where I think if we don't, there's gonna be a lot of money that evaporates and goes into the pockets of larger corporations. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, you know, here at Duke, we've got a fair bit of infrastructure to help us writing grants, and we're Duke University. And some of that federal government red tape is really intimidating. We're like, well, I don't know if it's worth the investment of time and resources to actually get that money. We're not a grassroots organization looking to do community gardens in Raleigh. So I think that's the biggest change. We can figure out how to clear that out. Somebody had an idea of trying to develop like an AI app type thing to say, okay, let's create a form for whatever your needs are, pump out a form, and then hit every agency or every call for proposals that are out there, and make that publicly available. So you just put your needs in for this thing and crank it out. That's kind of like discussion over beers rather than anything serious. But it's got a good idea, right?
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for being with us, and especially thank Dr. McAdoo for his work and for this presentation.
Thank you for your time.